they got contact. And then we got to like the hate place, and we were like, I come now. And so they had just like truck cabins. Oh yeah. And I was like, get it right now. They can meet us there. I got like this next place, and it was like all these beers. So one was like a chai flavored one.
Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming to our Turbeville speaker series today. We're very pleased to be hosting Dr. Patrick Grzanka. You all know me, Dr. Andrea Romero. I'm the director of the Francis McClellan Institute. We are a research institute dedicated to carrying forward the legacy of Francis McClellan to focus on research, developing new research, and disseminating research findings on the resilience of children, youth, and families. As you all know, Francis was a business leader and a philanthropist here in Tucson and really all over Arizona. And today we are very lucky because we actually have Pamela Turbeville joining us. So I know you guys have heard this before, but Pamela is a University of Arizona alumni. She got her degree in family, consumer sciences, and education. And she was the recipient of the CALS Alumni Achievement Award. So I'm going to go ahead and invite her to come up here to say a few words about the speaker series. Or about herself.
No, I'm just going to stand right here because the main attraction is right here, and that's who we really want to hear. But I have enjoyed sponsoring this. It was years ago. I wanted to do something for the school. Part of my philosophy on life is that you work hard, you achieve a lot, but it's never because of you. It's always because of the people that came for you. They did things, they set up programs, they invested a lot for you to take advantage of. So I wanted to start giving back as soon as I could. And you can see how young I was in that picture. So it was a long time ago. And so I had an idea of like, I wanted to do a donation and I didn't know what to do. And sometimes when you are a business person looking outside in, you don't know what people want or need. And so we just were like, let's ask the faculty. And the faculty said, we never have money to bring in really edgy, interesting, forward-thinking speakers. And so it wasn't my idea. My idea was to listen to the faculty. The faculty takes complete credit for the speaker series. So glad to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Katie Siders, a faculty member here. Dr. Patrick Grzanka comes from the University of Tennessee, Nashville. He's currently an assistant professor. He received his PhD in 2010 from the University of Maryland in American Studies. He's very accomplished. His research, as we will soon find out, is focused on sexual orientation, beliefs, and emotion and behavior, guided by intersectionality and multicultural feminist theories. He has published well over 25 articles, a book in progress. He is also an editor of the Journal of Counseling Psychology. He also has numerous teaching awards, both nationally and at his university, and research awards. So we're really excited to have Patrick here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
That very kind introduction. I'm going to pull this slide down and get my stuff up there on the screen. I would like to thank thanks so much for having me here, for Dr. Romero, to the Norton School, the LGBT Institute, Women's and Gender Studies, who co-sponsored today, and especially Dr. Siders, my dear friend and collaborator, who made this visit possible. It is always a pleasure to be in Tucson, here at the University of Arizona, and I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to share my work with you today. I'm going to talk about my new book project, which is titled The Born This Way Wars, Science, Sexuality, and the Future of Equality. Though my book is still, I suppose, in the early stages, though it feels like I've been working on it forever, it's really the culmination of about a decade's worth of research on sexual orientation beliefs. And I want to clarify, and do this whenever I give my talks on sexual orientation beliefs, that my research is not about what sexual orientation is. In fact, it's about what you think it is. So I want to sort of get that as a disclaimer right off the bat. You will not leave here knowing the truth about where sexual desire comes from. I actually hope that when you leave here, you might actually think a little bit differently about that question and why it is that we're so invested in that question. So I don't want to find out if you were born straight or gay or made that way or chose it for yourself, but in understanding why it is that you might believe one way or the other around those questions. I care about these beliefs for many reasons that I hope will soon become evident, including why certain beliefs about sexual orientation may correspond with more or less prejudicial attitudes, discriminatory attitudes towards sexual minorities and gender minorities as well, a term I'll be using throughout the talk. I've divided the talk today into 3 parts. In the beginning, right now, I'm going to situate what I call the Born This Way Wars. The second part of the talk will introduce some of my published work on sexual orientation beliefs, and then I'm going to conclude with the new stuff from the book, some of these interviews that I'm doing with people who identify as key players in the Born This Way Wars, and I'll tell you a little bit about what they have to say. So, part 1. I'm going heavy-handed with the war metaphor here. Confrontations. Right, when the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the 2015 Turbeville v. Hodges decision, the rights of gay men and lesbians to marry were predicated on unsettled scientific findings rather than an enduring philosophical presumption of human dignity. Nonetheless, many lesbian and gay rights advocates called this a watershed moment in the fight for equality. In the majority opinion, Justice Anthony M. Kennedy reflected on the shifting meanings ascribed to marriage. He based partially his defense of gay and lesbian rights on the biological permanence of sexual orientation. Quote, "Only in more recent years have psychiatrists and others recognized that sexual orientation is both a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable," end quote. While the history of marriage, Kennedy noted, is one of both, quote, continuity and change, end quote, sexual orientation is constant. The difference is that we now recognize it for what it has always been, according to Kennedy. Normal and unchangeable. Given that the legal basis for the decision turned upon due process and not the Equal Protection Clause, which would require a stipulation that sexual minorities constitute a discrete, what lawyers call suspect class, deserving equal protection under the law, Kennedy's elaboration sort of shoved in here, this kind of editorializing, which he draws upon scientific knowledge to say that sexual orientation is immutable, is all the more curious as it is telling, I think. As Lisa Diamond and Charles Roski recently reflected, the Oberfeld decision is a social artifact as well as a legal ruling, and as such possesses both juridical and cultural implications, potentially influencing the way that sexual minorities are perceived, as well as how they perceive themselves. Just a few years earlier, actress Cynthia Nixon reflects in the New York Times on being chastised by several high-profile LGBT advocates and organizations for saying that for her, being gay is a choice. She notes that there is no litmus test for being gay, and that members of the community should not police their membership ranks. She also notes that we are, quote, one group. She later qualified her statement and identified as bisexual, which to her is not a choice, but, quote, a fact. She did say, though, that, quote, "I believe we all have different ways we come to the gay community, and we can't and shouldn't be pigeonholed into one cultural narrative, which can be uninclusive and disempowering." I made 3 slides before Lady Gaga. 2011, Gaga releases a new album to huge press and mixed acclaim. Born This Way catapults her to LGBT advocate super status. She later creates the Born This Way Foundation to support gay youth and as an anti-bullying project, and it joins Dan Savage's It Gets Better project as one of the most high-profile LGBT advocacy organizations in the United States. And whether or not you do LGBT studies or involved in LGBT advocacy, inevitably you encounter the deployment of Born This Way language now around LGBT advocacy all the time. It's become ubiquitous. I want to briefly highlight this controversy, which broke out of the academic world and into the mainstream in summer 2012. The primary claim of sociologist Mark Regeneris' June 2012 social science research article is that gay and lesbian parents have fundamentally more unstable households than their straight counterparts, and that children of same-sex parents are more likely to be delinquent along a variety of metrics. In response to his criticism, he said, and this was directly in an interview to the newsletter Focus on the Family, the ultra-right-wing anti-LGBT organization based in not Fort Collins, Colorado Springs. All right, quote. Though the journal and the American I got taken to task for leaning on young adults' assessment of their parents' relationships. I didn't ask them whether they thought their mom was a lesbian or if their dad was gay, because in part, self-identity is a different kind of thing than behavior. A lot of people weren't out in that era. I think we can all think of moms and dads when we were growing up that we either knew or suspected were gay or lesbian, but never, quote, came out of a closet, so to speak. So I didn't want to make the assumption that these young adults would identify their parents as gay or lesbian, so I kept the focus on relationship behavior. Though the journal and the American Sociological Association ultimately conclude that the research was bullshit and never should have been published, Regnerus never relented about his findings, which, again, if you haven't read it, it's kind of a page-turner, the piece. It's just absolute garbage in terms of method, because one of the ways that he assesses whether or not the child's parents were gay or lesbian is the child's self-reporting if they thought that their parent may have had a same-sex relationship ever. So that's how he coded for gay and lesbian. Yeah. So he told this to the ultra, he did, however, qualify the way that these categories under investigation were defined and interpreted, as he does in this quote, to focus on the family. This past behavior for him is really where we see whether or not someone is gay or lesbian. And really it's the perception that you have had sex with someone in the past, not regardless of whether or not you might presently desire to do so or identify as such. All right, same year. The Grammy-nominated Same Love by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis featuring Mary Lambert, became central to gay marriage advocates' campaign to pass Washington State Referendum 74, which ultimately legalized same-sex marriage in the state of Washington. Macklemore was largely embraced by the gay and lesbian mainstream as an exemplary straight ally. His lyrics reflect two core themes in the song: that queer love is not queer at all, but as the title suggests, the same. So the same as straight love. And that sexuality is immutable, as Lambert sings in the hook that most of us have probably heard, and I can't change even if I tried, even if I wanted to. So I'm going to come back to this later, but I want to introduce a controversy that happened in 2014 when a young writer, a gay journalist, Brendan Ambrosino, wrote a critique of Macklemore's song in The Atlantic. Quote, many people do feel as if their sexuality is something they were born with, and I have no reason to disbelieve them. But as I and other queer persons will readily confirm, there are other factors informing our sexualities than simply our genetic codes. This piece about Macklemore and this author's personal identification as having expressed that for him his sexuality is as much a choice as it is something that he's inherited, made him and the publication quite a lightly ground for criticism, especially criticism from the gay left. So that's Brandon in the New Republic. Gabriel Arana in the same publication said a few days later, this line of reasoning has a hip post-gay appeal, but it is eye-rollingly naive, a starry-eyed view you might expect from a college student who's just taken their first queer theory class. Those of us who support LGBT rights are committed to the Born This Way narrative, not as a civil rights strategy, but for the simple reason that it's true. It's interesting to see, and as I said, we're gonna come back to this later because I've interviewed both Brandon and Gabriel to talk about their thoughts on this controversy. But Karen Thompson, a queer theorist, had earlier reflected on same love and said, why, in a great essay called Same Love, Same Old Shit, question mark. But why does it take a white dude who phobically disavows his own fleeting homosexual identification, Macklemore starts the song with lyrics about wondering if maybe he was gay, as just another instance of buying into stereotypes, to make the case for gay marriage and gay biologism on pop radio on our behalf? So one of the things that Arana sort of misses in his critique of Ambrosino is that many people, those of us who might take or even teach queer theory classes, had our issues with Macklemore's logic and had been expressing those sort of just outside the mainstream. All right, lots of fighting going on. Here we go. Renowned neurosurgeon and Republican presidential hopeful Dr. Ben Carson effectively tanked his campaign when, in response to the question, is being gay a choice, he told CNN, absolutely. because a lot of people who go into prison straight, and when they come out, they're gay. So, to return to the scene with which I began, only months after Carson's death, the Supreme Court would offer the exact opposite argument, that homosexuality is normal, not something you would associate with criminality or prisons, and unchangeable. This is the paradox of Born This Way logic. On the one hand, this rhetoric has played an essential role in ushering in the most expansive era of LGBT rights in American history. On the other, it seems to advocate a narrower version of sexuality than what is licensed by actual human diversity. My project represents an attempt to understand the cultural, legal, and scientific transformation of sexual orientation from the disorderly, iconoclastic agenda of the sexual and gender liberationists at Stonewall in 1969 to the normal, civil, and immutable legal subjects of the Obergefell decision. American public opinion about sexual minorities has shifted dramatically, not only in terms of how people evaluate them, as good or bad, as normal or deviant, but in terms of what we believe sexual orientation actually is. Whereas a small minority of Americans believed that sexual orientation was inborn in 1978, according to Pew, Americans were almost evenly divided in 2015 as to whether or not gays and lesbians are born that way. And my own research and others suggest that young people are not, in fact, divided at all, and they had very much internalized Born This Way discourse. While scientists have been on the hunt for the biological basis of sexual orientation, which some cheekily refer to as the gay gene, inconsistent, unreliable evidence leaves sexual orientation's nature and origins more elusive in the scientific record than it tends to be in the court of public opinion, or the Supreme Court, for that matter. My point is not that Ben Carson is right, or that Lady Gaga is wrong, but that these moments of debate and controversy underscore how Born This Way logic has become so dominant that even suggesting subtle disagreement leads to immense and immediate backlash. But what if the biology of sexual orientation mattered less than its sociality? In other words, and this is the central question of my book, does what we think sexual orientation is matter more than what it may actually be? On to part 2, tactics. So the Born This Way wars reflect the diversity not only of attitudes towards LGBT people today, though I am specifically talking about sexual minorities and not trans folks, we'll get to trans issues in a little bit. But the various beliefs about what sexual orientation even is, like how it's defined, where it comes from, what constitutes sexual orientation categories, if it can be changed, etc. I think I care about beliefs about sexual orientation because I think, and there's psychological and other empirical evidence to suggest that they influence attitudes towards sexual minorities and vice versa. So that's what you see on the screen there, is that this is sort of the fundamental assumption that psychologists make, that these beliefs tend to influence attitudes and vice versa. They co-constitute each other. And indeed, much of the struggle for lesbian and gay equality has been framed in terms of sexuality's origins and its immutability. So in contrast to activism for African Americans during the civil rights movement through today, that has challenged and debunked the scientific racism of the eugenics movement, as well as feminist efforts to dismantle the pseudoscientific arguments about male superiority, some gay and lesbian activists and straight allies have embraced biological explanations of sexual orientation as a way to advocate for equal treatment under the law, as well as for broader social acceptance. This turn to biogenetic explanations of sexual orientation has included complex maneuvering by lawyers, psychologists, politicians, activists, celebrities, scholars, and ordinary Americans who embraced a rhetoric that we're just born this way. But the Born This Way zeitgeist has not been without its own controversies. Some scholars and activists have argued that the legal gains of the past several years have been accompanied by serious cost to sexual minorities, gender nonconforming individuals, and to even broader understandings of equality itself. In my book project, I'm arguing that the Born This Way wars are replete with victors, casualties, tactics, sacrifices, occupations, assassinations, and crises of conscience that often accompany war. The deployments of these beliefs in the interest of attitude change, the management of public opinion, the advancement of science, and the acquisition of social and legal security represent the landscape of a war that continues to inform, even in the post-Obergefell US, how we conceptualize sexuality, discrimination, and even broader notions of identity and inequality. That is who we are and what rights do we deserve. Sexual orientation beliefs, the study thereof, are not new to psychologists, and I'm going to go over just a little bit of the ways that these issues have been traditionally approached and framed. So one of the first things that you kind of learn in a social psych prejudice classroom is going to be the differences between essentialist beliefs and social constructionist beliefs. And I have a list up there that's informed by some scholars and then just sort of my own way that I teach these. You'll see essentialism is defined as a worldview that thinks about categories in those ways on that list. Discreteness, that is the non-overlappingness of categories. Uniformity, consistency. Informativeness, once I know this about you, that you belong in this category, I know a lot about you. So that category informs my understanding of who you are. Naturalness, that category is not a social construct. It doesn't come from a decision people made. It's a natural kind, like an element, okay, as opposed to a social grouping. Immutability, can't be changed. Like once you're in the category, you're stuck there. Stability, consistency over time. Inherence, this is the like, I can't even tell you exactly what it is, but there's just something, there's a there. Necessity, so like there are certain characteristics that one must possess to be a part of that category. And exclusivity. In the case of sexual orientation categories, this looks like you can't be lesbian and bisexual, you have to pick one. Social constructionist beliefs, on the other hand, tend to emphasize the converse. So unrealness, this doesn't mean imaginary, but it does mean that the social categories that we use come from somewhere, and that isn't from like the divine intervention, but rather that we make these things up socially, historically, for different purposes. It emphasizes context, history, the idea that social categories will shift depending on what context we're in. Fluidity, that people might experience movement across categories, for example, or that the categories themselves could change. That we know, for example, that the category homosexual and who gets put in that category has shifted over time, as well as categories like bisexual, which was first developed by German scientists to describe individuals who today we would call transgender. Okay, so these categories shift. Contingency, that is like, that it kind of depends, like depending on where you're at and what other factors might be involved, you might not be in that category. For example, some public health researchers might group men who identify as gay and men who identify as straight in the same category of MSM, that is, men who have sex with men. Okay, so regardless of how one identifies, if you're exhibiting the behavior, you might be grouped in that category together with other people with whom you do not share an identity. Arbitrariness. This is that like when we make categories, we tend to have to kick certain people out who are on the margins, biracial people, for example, people who hold multiple ethnicities. And social constructionism emphasizes the arbitrariness of where we draw those lines. And another hallmark of social constructionist approaches is attention to power and inequality, the role that power plays in the way that we make categories and how we use them and deploy them. Okay, so that's just sort of a general sketch of the essentialism versus social constructionism debates. Now I want to take it to the era of sexual orientation, or to the topic of sexual orientation. So essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation tend to look like this. Sexual orientation is not a choice. It's biologically inherent. You're born with a sexual orientation that is outside of your control. Sexual orientation categories are clear categories deserving of civil protections. And this tends to be what was advanced by the leading LGBT advocacy organization in the United States, the Human Rights Campaign, which was using these kinds of arguments to advance marriage equality, military service, and hate crime legislation. Now, social constructionism, what does this look like? The idea that sexual orientation categories are historically recent and contingent, that would be something that you learn, for example, on the first day of queer theory. Sexual orientation and sexual orientation categories are influenced by power relationships, by inequality. Okay, so like coming out, for example, moving from one category to another as your identity is implicated in power relations, the freedom with which someone can claim an identity. You can't even practice their identity. It's about power. That sexual orientation is a social concept used to arbitrarily group individuals. We could have very different configurations of sexual groupings in a society. We could group people by the kinds of sex they like to have, the frequency of sex they like to have. But we choose object choice, that is who you like to have sex with, as the grouping category, and that's arbitrary. Queer theorists have argued that really what we need to do is deconstruct heteronormativity, the implicit assumptions of heterosexuality that organize and structure our universe. And this is the kind of language used by a very different kind of movement, ACT UP, sexual and gender liberationists, the folks who would reject the human rights campaign's argument about sameness instead for a more kind of radical vision of sexual liberation. What the essentialist versus constructionist binary I don't think accounts for very well when it comes to sexual orientation is this question of choice. And choice has been a lightning rod issue in the historical debates about sexual orientation. So agentic themes, that's what social scientists call like the ability to make choices, how much freedom we have, sort of control of ourselves. They're not really well accounted for by essentialism versus social constructionism. Some agentic beliefs might be that, for example, being LGBT or queer is a political choice, like one that a person makes because they want to make a statement about who they are. Being LGBTQ is a choice you shouldn't make it. Like, so that's like the same two sides of a coin result in very different political outcomes there. Also, like if it's a choice, fine, let's teach you how to unchoose it. Choice also, women of color feminists in particular, have really given us a lot of language around that when one claims an identity, especially if it's a minoritized or stigmatized identity, that's part of a struggle, one that can be lived and inhabited every day. Thinking about Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, have used a lot of choice rhetoric in very empowering ways. And then, of course, convergent therapists, people who engage in sexual orientation change efforts, believe that the choice to act on one's same-sex desires can be undone by willpower, by faith, or by therapy. Okay, so it's like, what a minefield there. You know, we can go a lot of different places with choice. The consequences of essentialism have been really well documented. Again, to go back to social psychology, prejudice and discrimination researchers have been using essentialism for a really long time, both in the domains of race and gender. So that is asking research questions like, if you hold essentialist beliefs about race, what does that look like in terms of your levels of prejudice? Similarly, if you hold essentialist beliefs about gender, how is that going to look? How are you going to score? Because we measure everything. How are you going to score on like sexism inventories? Are you going to be more sexist than somebody who might hold less essentialist beliefs? Essentialist beliefs about race and gender pretty universally correspond with negative attitudes towards women and people of color, okay? So an example of an essentialist belief about race is that black people are similar to one another and really different from white people. Like that there's some things that I don't even know what it is, but they're just really different, right? And then that's gonna correspond with racist attitudes, with prejudice. Similarly, notions like that women just have some fundamental capabilities that are less than men are then going to translate in patriarchal attitudes. Some essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation, on the other hand, tend to predict positive attitudes towards sexual minorities, which is really kind of confusing. We have this idea that if sexual orientation is innate, like it really shouldn't be judged. If it's an essential characteristic, you shouldn't be judgmental. If people can't control their sexual orientation, then what are you so upset about? Just let them be. But if sexual orientation is innate, and especially if we can locate it on the genetic code, then it can be screened for in utero and also potentially cured, okay? So then that essentialist belief gets dark really quickly and eugenic. And people may hold, and Peter Hagerty's fabulous work has demonstrated this, that oftentimes people hold essentialist beliefs to justify their prejudicial attitudes towards sexual minorities. So you hear a lot of essentialist language, and that language has just come up to buttress and support a prejudicial attitude, a homophobic attitude that was there to begin with, okay? So the directionality there is kind of interesting. Consequences of constructionism. Constructionist beliefs about race and gender correspond with affirmative attitudes towards women and people of color. When you hold the belief, for example, that people of color have been denied resources which shape life chances and outcomes, you are likely to have less prejudicial attitudes towards racial minorities. Similarly, women have been systematically denied employment. This explains differential achievement, not inherent differences in aptitude. That's another example of a constructionist belief. Constructionist beliefs about sexual orientation are really not very politically legible, so we don't know that much about that. It's a sort of classic question in queer theory. How do we even talk about these ideas in the public sphere? The notion that like sexual orientation categories aren't natural, that would make lots of our friends and family members' heads explode. Like what do you mean, you know? Queer theorists are known for saying things like heterosexuality is the state-sponsored religion and we need to abolish it. Like, that's not a politically legible statement or claim, okay? So psychologists have had trouble studying what this looks like at an empirical level because we turn most everything into a scale and it's hard to measure these things. We do know, though, that even though we kind of attribute most social constructionist themes and ideas to the gay radical left, we also know that some of these ideas have been co-opted by the far conservative right, such as, if it's all a social construction, friends, then it doesn't get written into the Constitution. You can't have equal protection if you're saying this is just like a thing you're going through. That's been sort of written into the legal code in decision after decision. And then there's, of course, the other notion, which was what the court upheld in Bowers and then struck down in Lawrence with regard to sodomy laws. There was the guiding principle that it's fine if it's a choice, and you can make that choice, but you cannot do it in public. Okay, so that's been a legal argument. Agentic beliefs, okay, about race, and they are not as prevalent. Okay, so before Rachel Dolezal, I don't even think we talked about it very much, but the notion of like choosing one's race is important in multiracial studies, and it has been controversial in the study of mixed ethnicities and mixed raciality. Barack Obama brought up a lot of this for Americans, brought up a lot of things for a lot of Americans. Rachel Dolezal's transracial declaration, is sort of an example of an agentic belief, but they're not particularly politically prevalent or salient when it comes to race. In gender, they are. Agentic beliefs are really important, especially in transgender rights and gender studies. We've studied things like cisgenderism in science, where we see scientists asking questions about, like, is being trans a disorder, or is it a choice? Is it a disordered choice? This is kind of that problematic stuff that we've seen. Agentic beliefs about sexual orientation have empirically corresponded with negative attitudes. Choice discourse in the US is largely controlled by the heterosexist right, and they use choice discourse to describe sexual minorities in very similar ways to describe women seeking abortions and comprehensive sex education. You can choose that, we're not paying for it, is sort of the logic there. And that's privacy, back to privacy. Like, you can do it in the private sphere, you do not get state support for this. But choice can be a progressive statement again. So like back to Cynthia Nixon, who gets lambasted for saying that her sexuality is a choice, but she's obviously not a homophobe. So like, how do we reconcile with the messiness of these beliefs? I mean, sort of like a good psychologist was like, let's measure it, let's make a scale, and that's what I did. And for part of graduate school and then during my time at Arizona State, we invented the sexual orientation belief scale. The SOBS, SOBS. This is just an example. I'm not going to talk numbers, I'm going to talk about items today. And we can talk about numbers later, and you can read the development scale. The development piece was published in 2013 in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and a follow-up was published in 2016, also in JCP. We have 4 content domains in the version of the scale that can be used with anyone. That is people who identify as any sexual orientation. And I'm going to explain what these mean. 31 items, by the way, so 31 questions you fill out to get a score on these. Discreteness. 6 items. This is characterized by, sexual orientation is characterized by clear boundaries between category groupings, and then an individual may only claim membership in one category grouping. A sample item here is SO is a category with distinct boundaries. A person's either gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So if you say, like, strongly agree to this, you're going to be high on discreteness. Okay, that's how we're going to talk about this, and that matters because slides are coming up in a little bit. I'll walk you through a graph. All right, sexual orientation items here in homogeneity. These items emphasize the similarity of group members. Every single item includes the word same, for example, and a sample item is there are more similarities than differences among people who have the same sexual orientation. So this is this concept that like gays and lesbians are just really similar to one another, and they're more similar to each other than they are to straight people. This may reflect outgroup homogeneity effect, a concept that's really important in social psych. Naturalness. This is the born this way factor. Okay, so sexual orientation is innate biologically based, characterized by early life fixity, that it can't be changed, and it's stable across cultures. So one of the items actually is like sexual orientation categories have existed across all cultures and time. A sample item there, another one is biology is the main basis of an individual's sexual orientation. So if you say, I strongly agree with these items, you strongly agree with born this way discourse. That's how we would talk about it. Informativeness. These items emphasize the importance of sexual orientation and the groupiness of sexual orientation groups. This is called like entitativity there. That's what we call it, groupiness. There are no political items in these. There were when we gave this survey to sexual minorities, but instead these emphasize knowledge and information gained from sexual orientation. A sample item is it's usually possible to know a person's sexual orientation even without being told. I love this factor so much because Like if a gay person says that to me, I think that's great and true. But if a straight person says it, I'm like, shut up. So I think this one's sort of funny. Like gay people kind of get this one. It's for them. Straight people, it just means you're heterosexist. But anyway, this informativeness item is basically all about sort of like, once I learn who you are in terms of sexuality, I know who you are. Okay. So the thing that we think is good about the SOBS is that it contains these multitudes of belief domains and allows us not just to put beliefs on an essentialism versus social constructionism spectrum, but to look at a wide range of beliefs and also to see how people might hold them simultaneously. I mean, I think we all know, regardless of what you study in the room, you've met a person who seems to like function in their day-to-day life but hold contradictory attitudes, right, or beliefs. So people do that all the time, believe things that don't really make sense. And this scale, we hoped, would help us see things, how folks might hold multiple belief domains or strongly endorse belief domains that don't on the surface appear to be complementary or consistent with one another. So we have studied how the SOBS and scores on the SOBS might relate to things like identity. So like, what do your scores on the SOBS look like if you're straight as opposed to identify as a sexual minority? And we've also looked at how scores on the sexual orientation belief scale might predict attitudes, which is really cool. So like back to the first slide all the way in the beginning, this relationship between the beliefs and the attitudes, I'd like to know and better know and contribute knowledge to what kinds of beliefs are going to predict the least homophobic people, because that is the political angle of my work, is to promote social justice and to make sure that we have less hate and harm in the world. So if we can cultivate beliefs that correspond with less prejudicial attitudes, fantastic. So let me show you some results that we've gotten in the past. And this is, I talked about the scales so much because I want you to be able to understand what you're looking at. Okay, so these are the results of a latent profile analysis, which I can answer in the Q&A questions about, that actually Dr. Snyder's and I did for this 2016 study. LPA is really, really cool. It's fancy statistically, but it's so cool because it helps you to see patterns of responses rather than just say like this variable was highly correlated with this variable. We actually get to say like who were the people in our sample and how did they score on this, okay? And there are 4 scores that you get on the SOBS: discreteness, homogeneity, naturalness, and informativeness. Okay, we called the group with the orange squares naturalness only. Remember that naturalness items indicate a belief that individuals can neither change nor choose their sexual orientation. So in other words, this is the born this way group. The other group with generally higher scores on all 4 subscales, the blue stars, we called them multidimensional essentialism. Okay. We examined social class, gender, and race to see if membership in particular identity groups would predict the likelihood of falling in. Forget about the purple diamonds for a second. We're just looking at the blue stars and the orange squares. We wanted to see like if you were white or a person of color, or if you were gay or straight, or if you were identified as a man or woman, would that help us predict like which pattern you'd belong to? Okay, and very interestingly, we found that being heterosexual indicated lower probability of being in that orange square group that we call naturalness only, okay? But most importantly, I think, so that was kind of neat, all right? So we basically got like the sexual minorities are going in that orange box group. But more interestingly to me was the similarity in the naturalness scores, that the straight people and the gay people in the sample all kind of converged in their endorsement of born this way beliefs. It was in the other belief domains that they differed, okay? So now let me get my mouse back. I need to be able to, is it up there on the screen? Yeah, there it is. So we'd have to have it travel over. It actually probably comes over this way, huh? So it's so confusing. There we are, sorry about that. Okay. So in the second sample, we did it again, and this is where the purple diamonds come in. We found the 2 same groups, the blue stars, the orange squares, but then we get the diamonds. And we called them high discreteness, homogeneity, and informativeness. This group, they were lowest on the naturalness scores and highest on the other ones. Okay. This time, sexual orientation did not correspond with group membership. So we didn't find in this sample, this was a bunch of women at another large Southwestern university up the street in Tempe. So we found among this group that the people who were the most homophobic were in the high DHI group and the multidimensional essentialist group. Okay, so this means that multidimensional essentialists and the high DHI respondents, the purple diamonds and the blue stars, we're also likely to score high on what we call modern homonegativity. That's like sort of contemporary ways of being homophobic. So not like I think all gay people should die, but more like I don't really like gay people, or I think it's fine if you're gay, I just don't want to see you do it. I don't want to see people kissing, for example, those kinds of attitudes. But once again, the score's all clustered on naturalness. So we've got groups of people who are scoring quite high, actually. I was shocked. I worked at ASU for 4 years and I was startled at how much variability in homophobic scores that we got and how high they were. They really, it's not, the narrative isn't just that like college students are all over it. We've got some issues at play. We had a lot of variability in these scores and lots of people who were scoring quite high in modern homonegativity. And they looked, in terms of their beliefs about the nature and mutability of sexual orientation, the same as people who were much less homophobic than that. So they're all sharing naturalness beliefs relative to their big differences in these other belief domains. So that's kind of what's coming out of the data for us. There were very small, statistically significant differences on those naturalist scores. I don't want to misimply the stats, but they were the most similar in naturalist and the most different in the other belief domains. So I'm doing all this quantitative work, and I'm still doing this work. Dr. Sanders and I have amazing data about the 2016 election and sexual orientation beliefs that we're wrapping up right now, and the findings are astonishing, including that naturalist beliefs did not predict whether or not you would vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, but belief in all the other domains did. Okay, so yes. So our Republican voters, our Libertarian voters, and our Democratic voters, and our Independent voters were not distinguished by their naturalist beliefs. They were distinguished by their belief domains, and strongly. Via multiple analyses, ANOVA regression, and late profile analysis. So we've got some robust evidence to support that, and we hope to be publishing that very soon. But I was trained initially as a qualitative researcher. I became a quantitative psychologist, and sort of after we wrapped up the paper that was published in 2016, I started to think about like how weird it is that I've never investigated sexual orientation beliefs qualitatively. I've never had interviews with people or focus groups where I've asked them to talk about these ideas, even though that was earlier in my career really my bread and butter, and I continue to do qualitative research in other domains. That's where the book begins, and that's where I'm going to sort of transition to the third part of the talk, which is short. Thanks for bearing with me, and I'll show you some of the things that I'm finding. So in the book, I'm exploring, I'm doing about 150 interviews. 75 of the interviews are with key players in the Born This Way wars. Scientists, lawyers, activists, celebrities who have made a big impact in the way that the public, scientists, and people in the legal profession think about sexual orientation. I'm doing another 75 interviews, which are farther along, perhaps not surprisingly, with members of what we call, brace yourselves, the lay public. I know it sounds gross, but it's what psychologists call people who aren't experts. I know it actually is really repulsive. I've got to think about better language to use. But that's our divide, okay? So I've got these lay people, and like the things that they're saying to me are absolutely amazing. I'm learning so much, and I'm developing the argument of the book, which is organized around this concept of the biogenetically queer citizen, and how people have, through their legislative work, their advocacy, their everyday lives, and their sexual life history, come to construct this person whose legal rights and legal intelligibility are defined by their bodies, and how we can know the truth of their sexualities. I began the talk by talking to you about these public events, these big moments of controversy that have animated what I call the Born This Way wars. In the Born This Way wars, chapter 5 of the book is called Operation Assassination, and it's about character assassination, or when people engage in what I call the politics of annihilation. This happens when people say things in the public sphere that buck Born This Way logic, and very quickly the troops are rallied to destroy them, usually on the internet, usually via social media, but also in other platforms. So I want to return to the Brandon Ambrosino issue, okay? So Brandon publishes this piece on January 28th, 2014. I wasn't born this way, I chose to be gay. Macklemore sent the wrong message in Same Love. 2 days later, Gabriel Arana lend-leased him in the same publication. Then Brandon responds after people troll him all over the internet. And by the way, let me be clear that while I'm sympathetic to anyone who sort of, well, no, I don't even mean that. I was going to say I'm sympathetic to anyone who gets shamed, but that's not true. I am vaguely sympathetic to like the fact that people were threatening to kill Brandon because of what he said, but I want to be clear that I'm not endorsing what Brandon said or what Gabriel Arana said. I approach all of this work as a social scientist. I want to know like why they said it and why it matters, less to take a side per se. Then some people wrote, like, what's wrong with choosing to be gay? Some people came to Brandon's aid and said, like, no, people are being really mean to him, we need to support him, he's just offering another idea, just because it doesn't fit with your worldview doesn't mean he should be ran out of the profession. Then Gabriel Arana, back in March of 2014, after Brandon got a new job working at Vox with Ezra Klein, he writes this whole piece about how Brandon's garbage. And it's really fascinating. So I wanted to talk. The Ambrosino controversy is one of the public shaming moments that I explore in the book. And so I interviewed Brandon actually a couple of times, both before I knew that I wanted to do the book and then after. And I asked him to reflect upon the controversy, of course, like what he went through. And this is one of the things that he told me recently. So Gabriel Arana, this is what he said. Gabriel Arana thinks that he understands everything there is to know about human bodies and human brains and human desires. And I mean, based on what? A Queer Theory 101 class he took in college? So I just think, yeah, I always want to, my impulse, and I'm a journalist, my impulse is to trust the human story and to trust the human at the center of that story. And when I'm interviewing a human and his story doesn't fit hand in glove with mine, the responsible and compassionate thing for me to do is to say, oh, okay, then it doesn't have to fit because it's not about me. The irresponsible thing and not compassionate thing for me to do is to say, well, damn it, I have to make your story fit mine, and if I can't do that, then that's your fault. To put a headline on the piece, he's referring to the piece about him, and then try to ruin someone's life, that's inhuman to me. And in this interview, he spends a lot of time talking about the nature of the industry. Right before he gives me this quote, he talks about clickbait and how he reads what happened to him as symptomatic of larger trends in journalism where people write inflammatory headlines to get people to share the story, to click on the story, and then engage in these kinds of fierce political, I'm fighting with, Republican Aunt Judy is yelling at Democrat Aunt Leslie on Facebook for hours and hours is kind of the idea. Gabriel Arana also identifies as gay, about the same age. He's Latino. I interviewed him because I wanted to know about his perspective on all of this and what he thinks about the saga. He said, the ways you're allowed to talk about these things, it's politically restricted. And if I say that I don't think necessarily that people are born gay, or that I think that's a simplification, you will have somebody go off on you before you can clarify what you mean. I say, who's that person? Who goes off on you? And he says, very often, activist types. They're the types of people who go to marches. And then he laughs, and I laughed with them, and he was being funny. I'd say people, I always use activists as not quite as a slur, because I have lots of activist friends, but I just know a lot of activists who don't think very much about the complexity of things. And who are very sure in their worldviews and who don't question a lot. People who have unquestionably absorbed I don't want to call it propaganda because a lot of it's true, absorb the messaging of the gay rights movement. The people who love Lady Gaga's Born This Way song and feel empowered by it, but who've probably never read a scientific article about sexual orientation. One of the things that I find fascinating about this interview process and doing the work of the book is that I don't know if you've already picked up that this is really weird in light of the position that Gabriel Arana took when Brandon Ambrosino wrote about his sexual identity. So in the interview with me, Gabriel Arana basically says he doesn't buy Born This Way discourse. He says that he went after Brandon because he thought Brandon was being sloppy and silly and trying to get attention. He uses the same argument that Brandon used about clickbait to describe why he went after Brandon so aggressively in the New Republic and in then other publications subsequently. He also tells me that he really thinks that he should have gone after the editors, and that he thinks Brandon is really just a tool, that a liberal-leaning publication allowed him to publish that piece because they thought, well, this gives us fodder to look like we're fair and balanced, and it's a young gay kid saying it, not a homophobic straight-rigger. And so Gabriel Arana attributes Brandon Ambrosino and the problem of his writing to lack of newsroom diversity. That's the argument that he makes to me. So the person who engaged in the character assassination is not actually a Born This Way hardliner at all. Someone who has very nuanced beliefs about sexual orientation and believes that sexual orientation beliefs should be informed by science. Okay, and he's very expressed throughout the interview that science should be determining how we think about things, not activism or people who go to marches. No offense if you've ever gone to a march. Brandon Emersino says very similar things, but uses them in very different ways. He accuses Brandon of thinking he knows everything, thinking that he understands the scientific record as finite and final, as opposed to fluid and changing. Brandon says the universe has been around for billions of years and it will continue to be, and that things will inevitably change, so why should we act so sure about things? They accuse each other, in other words, of kind of doing the same things. So I want to conclude with another interview that I've done with the only participant among the key players I've interviewed so far who has asked to remain anonymous. So all of my participants have the opportunity to disclose their identity, and that's why I'm using their identities. Mickey Flaherty is a very prominent transgender activist. And in the interview, she told me that the reason why she remained anonymous is that she wanted to give me a good interview and to be forthright, and that she couldn't be forthright if she were not anonymous. That if she told me what she really thinks about sexual orientation and gender identity, which for her as a trans woman are very intertwined. They have been for all of my participants, but my trans participants give me the most information, not surprisingly, about the way for them, their understanding of sexual desire is inextricable from how they do and think about gender identity. So this is what she told me, and this is the part of the interview where I've just cut off for you all, where she says, "This is why I'm anonymous. Having been socialized as male and not having been socialized as female has long-standing impact that definitely shades how I interact with people and how I interact in a room, and even the depth of my analysis of like a gender dynamic that's going on right in front of me. I've been slow to come to an understanding I had to have a political education about men taking up space and women being raised to not take up space, to recognize that maybe I took up too much space, right? Whereas if I'd been socialized female, I think that would have been really apparent. And if I'd been socialized female and been living as a woman in college, then there would have been a real consciousness raising around that. That would have been made much more cognizant to me at an earlier age. Some of these things I knew in the abstract but didn't start seeing for myself and viscerally responding to in the last few years. And that's complicated, she laughs. You know, there was a controversy a couple months ago when a prominent Black author, she said, I guess she's being interviewed, and the question was, are trans issues feminist issues? And I guess her answer was no, or not exactly. I forget exactly what her answer was, and I didn't entirely disagree with her insofar as I was like, it is different to be socialized as female. You get a lot of other shit that comes to you if you transition, especially if you become a trans woman, especially if you become a trans woman of color. And trans issues are feminist issues. I feel completely unequivocal about that. But I also think that that socialization leaves an imprint. That, for cisgender women, and it's not necessarily there for many trans women I've met. Another reason this interview is anonymous. There are trans women who take up space like men and have no consciousness of it. That level of interaction has not been critically instilled. And whatever this is like, my personal observation, but I think that has a lot to do with how we're socialized, and I think ignoring that is not helpful. Okay, so that's the part of the interview which to some people in this room may seem like a very obvious point, to others you may understand very clearly why she might not want to say that, because some of the things that she has said to me contradict hardline born this way ideology around trans issues, that transgender identities are revelations of what has always been, as opposed to social constructions. That is, when some people believe that as trans people, when they come out, that they are revealing who they always were. And so to suggest that when you were living the life before your transition, that you were being socialized as that gender, is considered transphobic, okay, by some people. So what Mickey wanted to do in the interview was tell me what she actually thought without committing political suicide and losing her efficacy as an activist. So I want to conclude by saying that, this interview I think is especially illustrative of, for how so many of my respondents, the question of sexual orientation beliefs is not one that sits in a vacuum of sexuality, but that is truly intersectional, like so much of my work tries to be and do. That is thinking about the relationship between race, gender, and sexuality as they co-construct each other and systems of inequality. The biogenetically queer citizen, this kind of object that I'm working through in the book, whose rights are linked to their genetic destiny, is not simply a sexual object. The biogenetically queer citizen has a race and a gender, even if we don't mark it explicitly. And what I'm exploring in the final chapter of the book is how I think that we cannot understand the biomedicalization of sexuality without considering the well-documented rebiologization of race and gender in the United States and in scientific discourse globally. So the book concludes with questions about how if we, I'd actually like to read this so that I say it right. The book concludes by situating the biomedicalization of sexuality vis-a-vis race and gender to raise broader questions about how we constitute both personhood and rights. I argue that what remains at stake in the conflict over sexual orientation's nature and origins is not actually the answer to the question, are you born this way? But can we, in the 21st century, in the post-genomic era of biomedicalization and epigenetics, envision social justice and civil rights beyond technoscientific framings of desire, behavior, and identity? In other words, can we even imagine a universe of sexual liberation that rejects the question of sexual orientation's origins and instead insists upon asking why we would care in the first place? Thank you so much for listening. We have a little bit of time. Sorry, I went a few minutes over. It's the first time I did that one. So thank you.
So we're happy to open it up for questions.
Yeah.
So what a great talk. I emailed Katie, I'm like, this is going to be a great talk. High expectations, really, really great, really great. So I had lots of
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I had
Thank
lots
you.
of things percolating in my mind, but one thing immediately that I need to say before I forget is the Journal of Marriage and Family is having a new decade review. I don't know if you know about the Journal of Marriage and Family.
I do, absolutely. JMT, it's like top social journal, actually.
So our
Yeah.
wonderful colleague, April Fudimo, who folks know in the room, who's also, like you, an expert in intersectionality, is writing that chapter, and they are trying to have more like application outside FSHD pieces, and so you would be perfect for that, because I feel like what you just talked to us about, we don't always get in FSHD. So I feel like that would be a nice way to think across different ideas, like especially race and gender and sexuality. So it's more of a comment, and I'll think of my questions in a minute.
Thank you so much for that.
So I'll follow up with that.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that. I want that on my radar, even if I can't.
It's really relevant. I think it's different in helping us think like across the different content areas that we study, how to think about it.
Excellent. Well, I think that if I could plug my book a little bit, I think that my book can maybe help too. It's written in a way to try to be super accessible to applications of intersectionality across the disciplines. And also, I just published a special section of the Journal of Counseling Psychology with my colleagues Carlos Santos and Bonnie Morani on intersectionality, where we surveyed, counseling psychologists aren't the same as people in FSHD, but they're close. Right. It's just that they do therapy too. They ask very similar questions, and I hope that maybe that could be a resource to you too. So.
I wanted to come back to something you sort of started with and punched at kind of throughout, but is the question of rights and the conditions under which one might have them. Mm-hmm. Especially the Supreme Court decision based on due process, or not on due process that you're talking about. Because it seems to me that one of the things that comes up in these kinds of discourse a lot is not what do you believe, but what's at stake in that belief, right? If I say that you are like a human who has characteristics that make you a subject of rights, then I have to give them to you. And I don't really like that, right? Yeah. And so I think there's something particular about sort of liberal philosophy, liberalism itself as a form of governance. And I wonder if there's a way of thinking about other forms of liberal governance in other countries in which we can see this discourse framing out in a different way. Right? I don't know if you have any...
That's such a great no, that's an extraordinary comment, and I'm going to give probably a little bit of an unsatisfactory answer. I will say that because I'm not a lawyer, though I think if I'm fortunate enough to get tenure and go on a sabbatical, I think I might try to pursue some more legal training as I'm working on this book, because I have to rely so much on my lawyer friends to read my work. I mean, I have to get everything fact-checked, because lawyers talk so differently than social scientists, and social scientists, especially like me, like mouthy ones, we try to like use words in different ways, and then you've like misused a legal term, right? So anyway, that's my caveat. The legal part of the book, therefore, I think is the most underdeveloped today. I intend on doing a lot of interviews with key players in decisions like Oberfell, and also relying on the amazing work done by lawyers to distinguish the different ways that rights have been adjudicated around these questions of like, you're a human being, you deserve dignity. The review piece that I mentioned by Lisa Diamond and her colleague Charles Roski is fabulous. Diamond's a psychologist, he's a lawyer. And what they do is trace every deployment of immutability arguments in the US legal code around sexual orientation. And they come down really hard against immutability. interestingly enough. They have found legal decision after legal decision that has turned upon dignity and due process as opposed to equal protection, that don't deploy immutability arguments, whereas we find other decisions that use immutability either to deny or to grant rights, but all, again, as I sort of began, like, are predicated on these unsettled scientific findings. I think what's really interesting is that many people do make the argument, like, a lot of queer activists, including people in my study, will say things like, I don't really even care if born this way is true, but I'm using it. It's like, it's what I'm using, and I believe in it, and don't you dare take it away from me, because we had to fight so hard for this lie. And so what that then shows is this incredibly deep political and affective investment in a scientific concept. Some people would refer to that as incredibly risky infrastructure then. What happens if, in the epigenetic universe of the next 10 years, which we can't exactly predict, this sort of tide changes with regard to the biological basis of sexual orientation, and then we've said that all of the rights are predicated on the biology. These kinds of what scholars have long called strategic essentialisms, I think, are fascinating, not only for the legal logics and the scientific logics that undergird them, but for their emotional politics, the ways that people are so deeply invested in them, that in fact then you might be compelled to engage in character assassination should someone contradict your belief in the public sphere. So does that help sort of, do you want to say something else?
Oh, no, just that, I mean, it is a very interesting legal and political situation where the only way you can claim that you have an access to right is because you have some immutable characteristic. And there's no other reason or condition under which liberal governance allows you to be a recognized subject.
Yeah, in order to gain access to a suspect class, generally, not exclusively, but generally, the justices have said you have to say it's stuck. It can't be a whim. Right. What's been interesting, queer activists have long said we need to argue about sexuality like religion. I don't know if that's salient to y'all, but that's like not a new thing. I've been saying it for a really long time. Even some of the initial decriminalization of homosexuality activists in Europe in the 1870s were saying religious freedom does not turn upon immutability. You can be a Muslim, you can be Christian, and then you can be Jewish, and then you can be atheist. And I have to protect your rights throughout all of those transitions in your life. And that access to that kind of suspect class, being a person who's practicing religion, is well established in the US legal canon. It's sexual minorities who have not embraced the idea of religion discourse. And so you find that there's like two staunch advocacy groups that don't want to do the religion analogy legally. The farthest left, that is those advocating for sexual minority rights, and the farthest right, who say, don't you dare put that sodomy in the same category as Jesus. So that's where we see that bifurcation, which is fascinating. But again, and I would like to emphasize, the Obergefell decision, gay marriage exists in the United States, not because of equal protection, due process.
So I just wanted to say that was fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you for collaborating with Katie, because, wow, Katie.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
It's-
This analysis.
Yeah, so.
Patrick is on another level than me, so.
And I really like the American Studies piece.
Oh,
It
thanks.
comes out in the way you deliver.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. As a person I'm the only person, as I said during lunch, I'm the only person in the United States, to my knowledge, who has a PhD in American Studies and is full-time appointed in the same department. If you meet another one, please. You have a lot of, when you sort of fall up disciplinarily in terms of the hierarchy, you can develop I've developed a lot of insecurity around my training, and it's only later in my career now, as I'm more established, that it's been really fun to kind of pull that stuff in, really use cultural studies. Thank you. It informs all the work that I do, and now I'm not afraid to say that. Before I used to be like, no, I'm just a psychologist, I promise. There was a typo on my diploma.
You do it well, so I would
Thank you.
capitalize on that one.
Thank you very much.
So you mentioned early on that some of the more radical views are really that the work we need to be doing is dismantling heteronormativity.
Yeah.
Right. So do you think the Born This Way wars is really a distraction from doing that other work? If not, how, in what ways is this contributing potentially to dismantling
That's such a good question, and one that I don't know that I'm also fully prepared to answer. I'd love to hear you for the book, and you can say this. So in doing this book, it's really important to me. I hold my own sexual orientation beliefs pretty close to my chest because I don't want to have the book received as a polemic or as a polemical sort of statement. I'm not Dan Savage or Andrew Sullivan. I'm not. That isn't my place in life. Dan Savage is here in Arizona actually yesterday. We gave a talk in Phoenix. I'm a social scientist and I want to understand what's happening here. I am concerned. I would as you were saying, a distraction, I couldn't have said it better myself. I am very interested in the ways that the fixation on biomedicalization of sexuality and the linking of biomedical ideas about sexual desire to personhood and rights, as you said, the ways that may distract us from the dismantling of sexual, gender, and other intersecting forms of oppression more broadly. That is, questions of why do we think that liberalism is the only way that we can understand the production and distribution of rights? Yes, I'm very concerned about that. Am I necessarily going to take a side? I guess that's up to me and my editor if they'll let me get away with it. I don't know. The book isn't written. I'm not sure if at the end I will say, kind of firmly that this distraction is there. But the reason why I went back to this slide is I think that this is where the social application is. And Katie and I were talking about this before. So I've got a student right now, he's finally, the data collection is finished and we'll have some answers for you soon. We ran an experiment where we gave respondents, we assigned respondents randomly into 3 different conditions where we targeted different sexual orientation beliefs using this as a rubric. And what we'd like to see is where the sexual orientation attitudes go, depending on whether or not you make a strict constructionist argument, a strict essentialist argument, or some combination thereof. And in one of the conditions, we really emphasize everything but naturalness. So we don't use a born this way argument, but we talk about these other beliefs, like that sexual orientation changes over time, that a massive proportion of the population reports moving from one sexual orientation category to the other over the course of the lifespan, and that this is natural and normal. So if there's anything about naturalness that we talk about, is that these kinds of variations in category overlapping and grouping are consistent, they're real. We emphasize in-group heterogeneity, that there's a lot of differences among sexual and gender minorities, and there are lots of differences among straight people. And then we emphasize this informativeness, that there's lots of evidence to suggest that being more masculine as a woman does not predict lesbianism, that being more feminism as a man does not predict same-sex desires that you're gay. So emphasizing those kinds of ideas, we want to see if that will make people less prejudiced. And so to me, the applied answer is contained in these kind of data. If everybody thinks that we're born this way, then that's not going to make a more just world. Because we know that lots of people hold those beliefs and still think that gay people are terrible. We're not deserving of the same rights. So that's what I wonder about. We're not talking about these things, these other belief categories and belief domains, and we're not doing any public education and programming around those belief domains. We're saying born this way, born this way, born this way, born this way. Thank you. It's a great question. You're getting thanked in the book for the distraction metaphor. Diversionary tactic, another word there, right? I'm writing it down.
I know, right?
Do you think these beliefs depend on beliefs on race, ethnicity?
Yes, I'm sure they're intertwined. That's my hypothesis. I would love to look at. So Jennifer Eberhard is really the name in the study of the psychological essentialism when it comes to race. And I would love to look at some of the measurement tools that she's used and look at consistency across domains. I'm also really curious about what about people who would vary across domains? Wouldn't that be fascinating? In a scary way. Where you might have a really anti-intersectional way of thinking, have really progressive views of sexual and gender minorities, and then really conservative views when it comes to race. That would be really interesting, Or would you have so we could use regression, for example, to explore whether or not sexual orientation beliefs, I'm just going to say like constructionist beliefs about sexual orientation and constructionist beliefs about gender predict racial attitudes above and beyond essentialist beliefs about race. That would be really interesting to see what has more explanatory power. And that would be like relatively simple analyses, and actually ones tested really kind of simple to explain, the degree to which like, oh, isn't this interesting that like, I can tell if you're racist depending on what your sexual orientation beliefs look like. Big deal. You know, or, and especially gender. Like what if we add gender beliefs? If you have essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation, maybe we don't know that sure what your racial attitudes are gonna look like, but if I fold in gender and you're essentialist there too, you're more likely to be. Does that make sense, Katie? My like just my stats right arm.
I really love the talk, by the way, that was great. I've been thinking more about how like our methods are driving our questions.
Yeah.
I research romantic relationships, so I've been thinking about how the analyses I want to do kind of require heterosexual couples, you know, distinguishing variables there.
Yeah.
Like I need the ones and the zeros.
Yeah.
I'd love to extend my study looking at how women go through menopause who have female partners who are also experiencing menopause.
Oh,
And I would lose information statistically because I wouldn't be able to distinguish the people in the relationship.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about this analysis here is really good because it brings it into groups. If we know these couples are probably functioning similarly to heterosexual couples,
Oh,
we know it might be better to do like this profile to see kind of like, you know, just what couples are looking like in general during this transition. And so I really appreciated like your use of methods to kind of more piece apart what's going on instead of just looking like the multidimensional aspect of it.
Oh, that's.
So I'm trying to think about how I can use like kind of what you did here if I wanted to extend that study into redistribution, looking at same-sex couples.
So two things about this. First of all, thank you so much for that observation. I'm really into method, and I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about method. Would you please email me, because I want you to be in touch with my student Elliot Spengler, who is collaborating on a content analysis of all of the couples research in psych. So he's doing, it's a meta-analysis actually, excuse me, and it's about heterosexism. So that's like the thrust of the studies, that we know virtually nothing about same-sex couples, and the methods push it, exactly. So I want you to know about that paper and that they're about to finish, and it's really amazing. It's going to not JMT yours, but the other one, which is called Journal of Marital. Like they use the word, instead of marriage, I think it's marital and family issues or something. The other thing I was going to say is there's another version of this talk that doesn't include the qualitative data, in which I talk about the difference between a variable-centered versus person-centered approach here, which is very much indebted to Katie's work, and she's the one who has really shepherded LPA in these domains. But I wrote a piece for Women's Studies Quarterly on a special issue on queer method, which describes all of this. So it's 2016. It's called Queer Survey Research on the Ontological Dimensions of Heterosexism. So in that piece, I take up sort of long-standing criticisms of quantification from queer, feminist, intersectional, anti-racist social scientists, that quantification is inherently a kind of violent process, that it's reductionary. And I argue that that's wrong. It's a diversionary tactic. That if we look at quantification as the problem, what we miss is that it's actually representation itself, and the way that we think we can represent people and measure and assess who they are, that's where the problem is. So we need to get back to sort of how we're conceptualizing data itself, not just measurement. Because you can be just as violent with an ethnography or an interview or a focus group as you can with a survey. They're all ways of taking people's experiences and representing them, and you can be violent in any of those kinds of practices. So what I use is LPA as an example of how one might be able to not be as reductionist, and to think less about the hegemony of the variable. That is that, like, well, what did this variable look like? The mean of this variable look like in relationship to the mean of this other variable, and instead think about who are these people, and how can we slice into our data so that we see them from an angle that's more ecologically valid, more representative of how they exist in the world, multidimensional. Yes, as opposed to just variables, right? Or cases in an Excel spreadsheet. So I think that requires a different epistemic orientation and a whole different way of thinking.
So if I had a position, would you be interested in
I miss the desert every damn day.
Thank you all for coming.
Before she leaves. Oh, I so appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoy your time here.